The dynasty that unified China lasted barely 37 years. The dynasty that inherited its infrastructure became one of the greatest civilizations in human history. That contradiction sits at the center of Chinese history, and honestly, it deserves more attention than it gets. By the early 600 seconds, the Sui Dynasty had already done the hardest part. After nearly 3 centuries of division and warfare following the collapse of the Han Dynasty, China was finally reunited in 589 AD under Emperor Wen of Sui. Borders stabilized, tax systems returned, grain production recovered, roads reopened. For ordinary people, that mattered more than ideology ever could. A farmer doesn't care which dynasty rules him if soldiers stop burning the harvest. And for a brief moment, it looked like the Sui had solved the problem that had haunted China for generations: how to hold such a massive territory together under one state. Then they destroyed themselves trying to make it permanent. The key figure here is Emperor Yang of Sui, who took power in 604 AD. History remembers him as arrogant, extravagant, almost cartoonishly reckless. Some of that is fair. But reducing the collapse of the Sui dynasty to one bad emperor misses the bigger mechanism underneath. Yang wasn't simply wasting money. He was attempting something enormous, turning reunification into an integrated imperial machine. That meant infrastructure on a scale medieval states rarely attempted. The most famous example was the Grand Canal, thousands of kilometers connecting northern political centers with the rich agricultural south. Millions of laborers were mobilized. Entire regions were effectively turned into construction zones. Contemporary accounts describe exhaustion, famine, and mass death among workers. Ancient chroniclers exaggerated numbers constantly, but even conservative estimates suggest one of the largest forced labor projects on Earth at the time. And yet, the canal worked. That's the uncomfortable part. The system actually functioned. Grain could move north efficiently. Troops could reposition faster. Trade expanded. Administrative control deepened. In practical terms, the Grand Canal became the logistical spine of imperial China for centuries afterward. The Sui built it. The Tang benefited from it. History can be very cruel to transitional regimes. Then came Korea. Between 612 and 614 AD, Emperor Yang launched massive invasions against the Goguryeo Kingdom on the Korean peninsula. The campaigns became disasters. Supply lines collapsed. Armies suffered catastrophic losses. Some historical sources claim over 1 million troops were mobilized for the first invasion alone. The exact number is debated heavily, but even if those records inflated reality by half, the burden on the population was staggering. Imagine paying crushing taxes, surviving forced labor projects, then watching endless military campaigns fail anyway. Eventually, the state began cracking from the inside. Rebellions spread across northern China. Local governors stopped trusting the capital. Aristocratic families started preparing private armies instead of sending loyal troops to the emperor. Grain shipments became unreliable. Entire provinces drifted toward open revolt. And this is where the story quietly changes direction. Because hidden inside the collapsing Sui system was a military aristocrat named Li Yuan, governor of Taiyuan and member of a powerful northwestern family with deep connections inside the imperial structure. He wasn't an outsider storming the gates. He was a product of the Sui order itself. That distinction matters. The Tang Dynasty didn't appear from nowhere, like some miraculous reset button. It inherited roads, canals, administrative systems, tax registers, military reforms, and political centralization already created by the Sui. The previous dynasty absorbed the chaos, expense, and political hatred required to rebuild a unified empire after centuries of fragmentation. The Tang arrived after the hardest work was already done, and that raises a difficult question we'll come back to later. How much of a golden age belongs to the people who shine inside it, and how much belongs to the exhausted generation that built the foundation first? Li Yuan did not overthrow the Sui Dynasty because he had some grand philosophical vision for China. He moved because the system was visibly dying, and experienced political families know one thing better than anyone else: collapsing states become extremely dangerous places to stand still. In 617 AD, while Emperor Yang remained increasingly isolated from reality, rebellions were already spreading across major regions of northern China. Provincial commanders stopped behaving like administrators and started behaving like survivalists. Grain depots were seized. Local militias multiplied. Communication between the capital and outer provinces weakened. Once that process begins, dynasties usually don't recover. The important detail is that the Sui state still looked powerful from the outside. It still had armies, still had tax systems, still had infrastructure. But internally, trust had evaporated. And empires can survive poverty longer than they can survive elite panic. Li Yuan understood this early. From his power base in Taiyuan, he gradually assembled alliances with military officers, aristocratic clans, and frontier cavalry forces. His position mattered geographically, too. Northwestern China had become deeply militarized during centuries of conflict with steppe powers, meaning families there understood warfare in a way many southern elites did not. That military culture became one of the hidden engines behind the Tang rise. A lot of people imagine ancient China as isolated and inward-looking. The early Tang period was almost the opposite. Its ruling elite had strong connections to frontier regions shaped by interaction with Turkic and Central Asian groups. Their cavalry tactics, military organization, even aspects of dress and court culture reflected that exposure. The Tang Dynasty looked Chinese, obviously, but it was also partially a product of Eurasian frontier politics. That matters later when trade explodes across Asia. For the moment, though, China was still burning. In 618 AD, Emperor Yang was assassinated by his own officers during a coup in Jiangdu. That sentence alone tells you how far the dynasty had fallen. Once palace guards start calculating survival odds independently, collapse is mostly administrative cleanup afterward. Li Yuan moved quickly. He captured Chang'an, one of the great urban centers of the ancient world, and established the Tang Dynasty. But the transition wasn't clean. China did not instantly stabilize because one emperor replaced another. Multiple warlords, regional regimes, and rebel leaders were still fighting across huge parts of the country. Real consolidation took years. This is usually where history videos speed up too much, because the interesting part isn't just that the Tang won, it's how they avoided repeating the exact mistakes that destroyed the Sui. The early Tang rulers studied the collapse obsessively. They understood the previous dynasty had overextended itself through simultaneous mega projects, aggressive warfare, and crushing labor demands. So instead of trying to dominate immediately through force alone, the Tang court focused first on reducing pressure. Taxes were moderated. Corvée labor obligations were reduced. Agricultural recovery became a priority. The state eased its grip just enough for society to breathe again. That restraint mattered more than people realize. Golden ages are rarely created by nonstop expansion. Usually they emerge after a state learns where its limits actually are. And the Tang leadership was unusually pragmatic about limits. Emperor Taizong, who came to power after intense internal conflict within the Tang ruling family, became one of the most capable political operators in Chinese history. He listened carefully to criticism inside court debates, often from officials who openly challenged him. Not because he was uniquely humble, rulers are rulers, but because the Sui collapse had shown what happens when emperors stop hearing bad news. There's a pattern here that shows up constantly across history. Disaster creates institutional memory. Sometimes. One small example says a lot. During the Sui period, grain transportation failures repeatedly triggered shortages near political centers. Under the Tang, the canal network was expanded and managed far more carefully, with granary systems designed to stabilize food supply during bad harvests. The same infrastructure that helped bankrupt the Sui became a tool for stability under Tang administration. The machine survived, the management changed. And while China stabilized internally, something else was happening beyond its borders. Trade routes across Central Asia were reopening. Turkic power on the steppe was shifting. Persia was weakening under pressure. The Byzantine Empire was exhausted from war. Almost accidentally, the Tang Dynasty was entering power at the exact moment Eurasia itself was becoming economically reconnected. Timing matters in history more than governments like admitting. A competent dynasty appearing during a favorable geopolitical window can look almost invincible afterward. But beneath the surface, the foundations of Tang's success still carried the fingerprints of the dynasty that collapsed before it. By the 7th century, Chang'an had become one of the largest and richest cities on Earth. Not in China, on Earth. The Tang capital probably held more than 1 million residents at its peak, if you include surrounding districts. Merchants, monks, soldiers, diplomats, Persian traders, Korean scholars, Turkic cavalry officers, Buddhist pilgrims from India, and bureaucrats preparing for imperial examinations that could completely alter their lives. Medieval Europe had cities, of course, but nothing operating at this scale of administration and coordination. And this is where the story becomes more complicated than smart dynasty creates golden age. Because the Tang didn't just inherit infrastructure from the Sui, they inherited momentum. The Grand Canal linked southern rice production to northern political power. Tax systems were already standardized. Regional fragmentation had already been crushed. Roads, granaries, census systems, and military colonies already existed in some form. The Tang leadership refined these mechanisms, but they did not create them from scratch. That distinction matters because it changes how we think about historical success. Sometimes the most important dynasty is not the one that prospers. It's the one that absorbs the political pain required to reorganize society first. And to be fair to the Tang, they absolutely improved the system they inherited. The equal field system attempted to distribute agricultural land more evenly among households, reducing the concentration of estates among aristocratic families. The imperial examination system expanded gradually, creating more pathways into government service beyond pure hereditary privilege. It wasn't modern meritocracy, not even close, but compared to many contemporary states, Tang administration was remarkably sophisticated. A peasant's son still faced enormous barriers, but for the first time in generations, education could theoretically move someone upward through the bureaucracy, instead of only through military loyalty or noble birth. That changes how a civilization thinks about itself. There's also a reason Tang poetry became legendary. Economic stability creates surplus attention. When societies stop spending every waking moment surviving invasion or famine, culture expands outward. Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, these weren't isolated geniuses appearing magically from nowhere. They emerged from an environment wealthy enough, connected enough, and confident enough to sustain intellectual life at scale. Civilizations write better poetry when roads are safe. Simple as that. But here's the reversal that complicates the entire Golden Age narrative. The Tang Dynasty remained deeply dependent on militarized frontier structures inherited from the chaotic centuries before reunification. To secure huge territories stretching into Central Asia, the court relied heavily on regional military governors known as jiedu shi. At first, this arrangement worked well. Frontier commanders defended trade routes, projected power westward, and helped turn China into the dominant state across East Asia. Then the balance shifted. Gradually, those military governors accumulated independent armies, tax authority, and regional influence beyond direct imperial control. Sound familiar? It should. This is exactly the kind of decentralization problem earlier dynasties struggled with repeatedly. The system producing Tang power was also quietly weakening the center underneath it, and the clearest example came in 755 AD with the An Lushan rebellion. An Lushan was himself a frontier military governor of mixed Sogdian and Turkic background, who commanded enormous forces near the northeastern frontier. After years of political tension inside court circles, he revolted against the Tang state, triggering one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Some estimates suggest the rebellion and its aftermath may have caused tens of millions of deaths through warfare, famine, and social collapse. Medieval population numbers are always messy, but even conservative calculations place the catastrophe at astonishing scale. The Golden Age didn't end cleanly. It cracked open, and there's something uncomfortable about how often this pattern repeats. States centralize power successfully, become wealthy, expand influence, then rely increasingly on semi-independent military or economic actors to maintain that scale. Eventually, those actors gain leverage over the center itself. Rome did this, the Abbasids did this, even modern powers flirt with versions of it through defense contractors, financial systems, or regional political blocs that become too integrated to control easily. Human institutions keep rediscovering the same structural limits wearing different clothes. I'm not saying the Tang Golden Age was fake, far from it. The achievements were real: technological innovation, literature, international trade, urban growth, state capacity. China during the early Tang period genuinely became one of the most advanced societies on the planet. But it rested on foundations built through extraordinary violence, exhaustion, forced labor, and institutional experimentation under the Sui. That earlier dynasty failed publicly so the Tang could succeed elegantly. History usually remembers the elegant part. There's a tendency to treat golden ages like they emerge from wisdom alone, as if one dynasty simply governed better, thought deeper, behaved more rationally, and prosperity naturally followed. History is usually messier than that, more cumulative, sometimes deeply unfair. The Tang Dynasty absolutely deserves its reputation. It turned China into the gravitational center of East Asia. Trade routes stretched from Chang'an towards Samarkand, Persia, even indirectly into the Mediterranean world. Paper production expanded. Woodblock printing spread texts faster. Buddhist scholarship flourished. Poetry reached a level that Chinese students still memorize more than 1,000 years later. But none of that appeared in an empty landscape. The Sui Dynasty had already reunited a fractured civilization after centuries of division. It standardized administration, rebuilt tax systems, connected north and south through the Grand Canal, and re-centralized political authority. Then it collapsed under the weight of its own speed. That's the part I keep coming back to: speed. The Sui tried compressing generations of state building into a few decades. Infrastructure, military campaigns, administrative reform, labor mobilization, all at once. Modern governments do versions of this too. Rapid industrialization drives, massive debt-funded construction booms, technological races justified by geopolitical fear. States convince themselves they can absorb unlimited strain because the strategic goal feels urgent enough. Sometimes they can't. And when collapse comes, the next government often inherits the useful parts while publicly blaming the previous regime for the damage. The Tang Dynasty criticized Sui excess constantly, fairly in many cases, but it also quietly kept using Sui institutions because abandoning them would have meant abandoning the foundations of imperial power itself. That contradiction sits underneath almost every successful civilization. One generation pays the construction cost. Another generation receives the prestige. There's also a broader geopolitical point here that people underestimate. The Tang Golden Age happened during a rare moment when several major Eurasian powers were simultaneously weakened or distracted. The Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persians exhausted each other through decades of war before the Islamic conquests transformed the Middle East. Steppe politics remained fragmented enough for Tang diplomacy and military campaigns to project influence westward. Trade routes reopened under relatively favorable conditions. China was skillful, but it was also historically well positioned. Those two things can exist together. Great powers often prefer narratives of inevitability because inevitability sounds deserved. In reality, timing matters enormously. A capable state appearing during a favorable geopolitical window can dominate for generations. The same leadership born 50 years earlier or later might fail completely. That doesn't reduce Tang achievement, it just makes it human. And honestly, there's another reason this story matters today. We're living through an era where governments everywhere are once again obsessing over infrastructure, industrial policy, supply chains, and strategic resilience. Semiconductor fabs in Arizona, Belt and Road rail corridors, port construction across the Indian Ocean, energy grids, AI data centers, rare earth processing facilities. States are relearning an old truth. Logistics decides power long before slogans do. The Sui Dynasty understood that too. Poorly timed wars and crushing labor demands destroyed them politically, but the infrastructure they built reshaped Chinese history for centuries afterward. The Grand Canal kept functioning long after the emperors who ordered its construction were dead. Farmers still moved grain through systems created by a dynasty most people barely remember. The canal outlasted the dynasty because physical systems often survive political legitimacy. That's worth thinking about carefully. My own view is that the Tang Golden Age was less a miracle and more a successful stabilization phase after an extremely violent national reconstruction project. The brilliance was real, but so was the inheritance. Remove the Sui reunification, the canal network, and the administrative centralization underneath it, and I'm not convinced the Tang becomes the Tang at all. One question still lingers, though. If a civilization's greatest era depends partly on the suffering created by the regime before it, who actually deserves the credit? The builders who failed publicly, or the rulers who arrived after the foundation was already poured? I'm not fully certain history has a clean answer to that. What I am certain about is this: empires love celebrating the harvest. They speak far less about the people who broke their backs planting the field in the first place.